Hello everyone! In today's video I will be showing you how I made this pair of pocket hoops. I'm actually making two of these. These are already finished and they're for a friend of mine. I wanted to try and make one pair first just to see how I had to sew it, and then I wanted to show you for the second pair how I made these. So yeah, this is how the first pair turned out. I'm very happy with what they look like right now, and I will be showing you how to do this. The pattern I used for the pocket hoops is from Corsets and Crinolines. I already had a PDF file of this book, but I recently also got a physical copy because this is literally my historical undergarment Bible. So I really wanted to have a book to just flip through and see what was inside. So I'm currently reading my way through this and I'm really enjoying it. I highly recommend getting this book if you're interested in that kind of thing. So this is the pattern I used. It's for 1760 pocket hoops. And there is an inch bar on every pattern so you can see how long it is. And for school I have these scaled rulers, and my 1/3 scale matched up exactly with the inches bar of the pattern, so I kind of just used that to measure how long everything had to be. But obviously this one is in centimeters and the bar is in inches, so I still had to convert all of the measurements to actually turn them into centimeters, and I wrote all of the measurements on the pattern. Some people might scream at me for writing in the book, but I don't really care about it. It's my book, so I can do whatever I want. Then for the construction of the pocket hoops, there really isn't much information about it in the book. All of the construction of farthingales, hoop petticoats, etc. is literally 1 page total. It's not much information at all, so I kind of had to figure out what to do by myself. I looked up some tutorials about it and kind of did what felt right to me, and I think I managed, so I'm just going to show you what I did, but I'm not in any way saying that this is either historically accurate or the perfect right way to do this. It's just what I figured out. For fabric, I'm just using a regular white cotton. In Corsets and Crinolines, it's mentioned that pocket hoops were usually made from cotton back in the 18th century, so that's just what I used as well. But I believe I've seen people use fabric such as linen as well, so I don't think it matters. I didn't film me cutting out my fabric pieces, but the pieces should be cut on the cross grain of the fabric. After cutting out my fabric pieces, I ironed them. I also immediately measured how wide and long my boning channels and waistband had to be. I always use a bias tape maker to make my boning channels. My boning channels are 1.8 centimeters wide and my binding is 1.2 centimeters wide. Bias tape makers are such handy tools to use and I highly recommend them. I stitched the circular pattern piece to the square piece. After that, I marked and pinned the boning channels to the pocket hoop piece. For this, I copied the placement from the Corsets and Crinolines pattern. Once all of the boning channels were pinned in place, I could start stitching them down. The square piece is attached to the right side of the large pocket hoop pattern piece. Stitching these together immediately closes off the boning channels on one side. To make sure I have as little raw edges on the inside of the pocket hoops as possible, I tucked under all of the seam allowances and stitched them down. This gave a really nice finish on the inside. I could now start adding the boning. I used 1.1 cm flat steel boning. I think flat steel is the best type of boning to use for this because it's very strong and keeps its shape very well, even with heavy skirts on top. When you're working with flat steel, it's very important to file down the edges really well and put some tape on them, otherwise the boning might work itself out of the channel and rip the pocket hoops. After adding the boning to all of the channels, I closed off the channels by stitching back and forth a couple of times. I gave the hoops a good press and also immediately pressed back the seam allowances of the bottom and the side of the pocket hoops, the round piece and the square piece. The circular piece is gonna be the bottom of the pocket hoops. To pin this, I used my wonder clips. These are great for keeping flat pieces of fabric together and were a real lifesaver while I was making these. The circular piece is a bit bigger than the bottom of the pocket hoops, so it had to be worked in a little bit. I then started stitching together the two pieces using a whip stitch and 2 strands of thread for extra strength. As far as I know, this can only be done by hand, since there is no way this will fit under a sewing machine. square piece is pinned to the side of the pocket hoops. You'll notice that by now they are really starting to look like something. This is once again stitched together with 2 strands of thread and a whip stitch. Next up is binding. I attach the front of the binding by machine. Usually I do this by hand, but I didn't have too much time to make these pocket hoops, so I decided to do this step by machine. Don't you just love running out of bobbin in the middle of sewing? The back of the binding is stitched down using a felling stitch. I use the stitching from the front side to stitch down the back binding, so there would be no extra stitches on the front. I should also mention that I cut the binding on the straight grain instead of on the bias. Historically it was sometimes done like this as well, since cutting on the bias can waste a lot of material and fabric was very expensive back then. Since I didn't have to bind any crazy curves, cutting on the straight grain worked fine for me. The top of the pocket hoops is pleated using a box pleat. I just measured the place on my waist to where the pocket hoops had to sit and divided that by 2 for the 2 top pieces, since there is a split right down the middle. They ended up being 9 cm each and 18 cm total. Repeat all of that on the other side. I added interfacing to my waistband and pressed back the seam allowances. Placement of the pocket hoops on the waistband was a bit tricky, but I got it right eventually. The tops of the hoops are tucked inside the waistband by about a centimeter. After that, they're stitched down. Lastly, I added a skirt hook to the front to fasten the waistband. And with that, my pocket hoops were finished. I love how these turned out, and it was such a fun little project to do. I think in the end they took me about 2 days to make, but if you work fast, they could probably also be done in a day.